Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about 7 of the mistakes I've made over the last 34 years that have actually helped me become a better hunter. Not the kind of mistakes you fix with a new call or a better piece of gear. I'm talking about the quiet mistakes, the ones that don't feel like mistakes at the time necessarily, the ones that feel like effort, like grit, like doing it the hard way, the kind of mistakes that let you stay busy, stay tired, and stay convinced you're improving while the results never really change. For a long time, I thought more years automatically meant more skill. I thought if I just kept showing up, kept grinding, kept suffering enough, things would eventually click. And sometimes they did, just enough to keep me coming back. I killed animals. I had good days. I had seasons that felt like progress. But what I didn't realize was how much time I was wasting by repeating the same patterns with more confidence instead of better judgment. That's the dangerous part. A lot of hunters don't fail because they don't care. They fail because they care deeply, but aim that effort in the wrong direction, sometimes for years. They chase noise instead of patterns. They rely on gear to cover skill gaps. They move too fast because movement feels productive. They ignore recovery because toughness feels like the answer. And they confuse experience with progress, assuming time alone will sharpen judgment. I know this because I lived it. This episode isn't about regret. It's about acceleration. It's about showing you the mistakes that quietly held me back for years so you don't spend your next years learning the same lessons the hard way. These aren't things I figured out overnight. They were learned through blown opportunities, unnecessary fatigue, a lot of frustration, and seasons where I worked harder than ever, but, hunted no better than before. If you've ever felt like you're putting in the effort but not getting the consistency you expected, if you've ever wondered why things still feel rushed, chaotic, or reactive after years in the field, this episode is for you. By the end of this, my goal is pretty simple. I want you to recognize at least one mistake you're still making, understand why it's holding you back, and walk away with a clearer picture of what actually moves the needle in becoming a better hunter. So let's get into it. For a long time, I chased noise instead of patterns, and I didn't even realize that's what I was doing. If something was happening, I went to it. Bugles, fresh tracks, recent sightings, a hunter telling me they were right here yesterday. Noise felt like opportunity. Noise felt alive, and most importantly, noise felt productive. If I was moving toward action, I felt like I was hunting correctly. But here's the truth I learned the hard way. Noise is usually the end of a pattern, not the beginning of one. When I chased bugles, I was almost always late. When I chased fresh sign, I was reacting to where animals had been, not where they were going. When I chased sightings, I was stepping into somebody else's moment instead of creating my own. I was constantly responding instead of positioning myself. At the time, it felt aggressive. It felt committed. It felt like effort. What it really was emotional hunting. I wasn't asking why animals were there, why they moved when they did, or what would pull them through the same terrain again tomorrow or next week. I was chasing proof that something was happening because proof felt reassuring. Silence felt like failure. The problem is that patterns don't announce themselves loudly. Patterns are quiet. They repeat. They're tied to terrain, pressure, wind, timing, and energy efficiency. And when you start hunting patterns instead of noise, your entire approach changes. You stop sprinting toward every sound. You stop bouncing between ideas. You stop letting other people's experience dictate your decisions. I remember the first time this really clicked for me. I was watching animals move through terrain I had walked past multiple times before, terrain I had ignored because nothing exciting was happening there. No calls, no sign explosions, just movement that made sense when I finally slowed down enough to see it. And that was a little bit of a gut punch. I realized that animals weren't disappearing. I was just out of position. I was arriving late to moments that were predictable if I'd been patient enough to study the pattern instead of reacting to the noise. Once I made that shift, hunting got quieter, but it also got clearer. I started spending more time in places that didn't feel urgent and less time chasing chasing things that felt exciting. And over time, those quiet places produced more consistent opportunities than all the noise I'd been chasing for years. That mistake alone probably cost me more animals than anything else I did wrong early on. And it's one I see a lot of hunters making every season because noise feels like progress, right up until you realize you've been moving nonstop without ever really being in the right place at the right time. Another mistake that held me back for years was over relying on gear to solve problems that were really skill issues. There was a long stretch where I honestly believed the next piece of gear was going to be the thing that fixed everything. Better optics would help me see more animals. A better pack would let me go further. Better boots would keep me fresher. A better rifle, a better bow, a better setup. I wasn't reckless about it. I researched, compared, upgraded, but what I was really doing was buying confidence instead of earning it. Gear felt like progress because it was tangible. I could unbox it, I could talk about it, I could convince myself I was improving without actually addressing the weak links in how I hunted. The problem is that gear can't think for you. No piece of equipment will fix rush glassing. No optic will make you patient. No pack will improve your decision making under pressure. And no weapon will compensate for poor shot selection or bad positioning. For a long time, I let gear mask those gaps instead of forcing me to confront them. I remember hunts where I had some of the best equipment available at the time, yet I was still missing opportunities, still blowing animals I never knew were there, still getting caught out of position. At some point, it became impossible to ignore that the common denominator wasn't my gear, it was me. That was a tough realization because gear is an easy place to hide. If something goes wrong, it's tempting to blame equipment. The glass wasn't good enough. The setup wasn't ideal. The pack wasn't right. Those excuses protect the ego, but they also stall growth. When I finally started focusing on skill over equipment, everything shifted. I learned how to glass better with whatever it was that I was using. I learned how to navigate and position instead of relying on technology to bail me out. I learned how to slow things down and make better decisions instead of trying to outgear bad situations. That doesn't mean gear doesn't matter. It does, but it's a support system, not a solution. Once I stopped expecting gear to fix my hunting, I started using it the way it's meant to be, to support good decisions, not replace them. And ironically, that's when gear actually started working better for me, because when skill leads and the equipment follows, you stop chasing upgrades and start creating opportunities. And that shift alone saved me years of frustration I didn't even realize I was carrying.
Step into the backcountry and step up your elk hunting game at Elk Camp 2026. This isn't a seminar, it's an immersive experience with real field training alongside successful elk hunters Matt and Saxton Hartsky. You'll learn how elk think and move, break down terrain like a pro, call with confidence, and practice 3 days of real-world elk hunting scenarios that mirror what you'll face on your own hunt. This camp was built to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be in the mountains. With limited spots and hands-on coaching, you'll walk away sharper, more prepared, and ready to hunt with purpose and confidence. Elk Camp 2026. Sharpen your edge. Register now and prepare for the season like never before at backboneunlimited.com.
Another mistake that probably cost me more opportunities than I'll ever be able to count was moving too fast and confusing effort with effectiveness. For years, I believed that if I wasn't moving, I wasn't hunting. Miles equaled commitment. Suffering equaled doing it right. If I was tired at the end of the day, I felt like I'd earned something, even if I never actually put myself in a position to kill an animal. Movement felt productive. Stillness felt lazy. The problem is that animals don't reward movement. They reward timing and position. By moving too fast, I was blowing animals I never knew were there. I was hiking through bedding areas at the wrong times. I was cresting ridges instead of side hilling. I was walking through transition zones instead of letting them work. And because I never saw the animals I blew out, I blamed bad luck instead of bad pace. Fast movement also destroyed my ability to read what was actually happening. When you're always in motion, you don't see patterns develop. You don't notice how Pressure shifts throughout the day. You don't catch subtle changes in wind or thermals. You're constantly reacting to the terrain instead of letting the terrain teach you something. I used to pride myself on how far I could go in a day, but distance doesn't mean much if it's the wrong distance. The real turning point for me was realizing that slowing down didn't mean hunting less aggressively. It meant hunting more intentionally. It meant moving with purpose instead of momentum. It meant choosing when to sit, when to glass, and when to relocate based on information, not impatience. When I finally started slowing down, a few things happened almost immediately. I started seeing more animals. I started understanding why animals were using certain terrain instead of just passing through it. And I started arriving in the right places earlier instead of late and tired. Slowing down also made the hunt feel calmer. My mind wasn't constantly racing to the next ridge or the next drainage. I could actually evaluate what I was seeing and make better decisions instead of defaulting to movement as a coping mechanism. That was a hard habit to break because moving fast feels tough. It feels like work. It feels like commitment. But toughness without awareness doesn't kill animals, it just burns a lot of energy. When I learned that effectiveness mattered more than effort, my hunts changed. I still worked hard, obviously. I still covered ground when it mattered, but I stopped moving just to feel productive. And in doing that, I started hunting places instead of just traveling through them. Another mistake I made for a long time was ignoring recovery and letting my body quietly dictate how I hunted without me ever admitting it. I told myself I was tough. I told myself soreness was normal. I told myself being run down was just part of doing it the hard way. And because I could still move, I assumed everything was fine. What I didn't realize was how much fatigue was shaping my decisions long before I ever noticed it. When your body starts breaking down, it doesn't usually stop you outright. It narrows your world. I'd wake up stiff and not want to admit it. I'd start avoiding climbs that I normally wouldn't think twice about. I'd shorten loops without realizing why. I'd glass less because sitting made my back tighten up or my knees ache. I'd choose terrain that felt manageable instead of terrain that actually held the animals. And every one of those decisions felt logical in the moment. They weren't tactical choices, they were fatigue management choices. The dangerous part is that I still felt like I was hunting hard. I was still covering a lot of ground. I was still out there all day, but my range of options kept shrinking, and with it, my chances of putting myself in the right place at the right time. For a long time, I confused toughness with effectiveness. I thought pushing through the pain was a badge of honor. What I eventually learned was that toughness without recovery just delays the breakdown, it doesn't prevent it. When I finally started respecting recovery, everything changed. I slept better. I fueled better. I built durability instead of just grinding fitness. I learned that recovery wasn't something you did after the season, it was something that allowed you to hunt correctly during the season. The biggest shift was mental. When my body felt solid, I hunted with more patience. I wasn't constantly worried about how many days I had left in me. I didn't feel rushed to force something early because I trusted I could stay effective longer. And that calmness showed up in my decisions, my movement, and my ability to wait out situations instead of panicking. Ignoring recovery didn't make me tougher, it made me narrower. It limited my options without me even realizing it. Once I started treating durability and recovery as part of the strategy instead of an afterthought, I stopped letting fatigue quietly run the hunt, and that alone probably added more real opportunity to my seasons than any single tactic I learned along the way. Another mistake I made for far too long was believing that experience automatically meant progress. I told myself that every year in the field made me better, that time alone sharpened judgment, that if I just kept hunting, things would eventually sort themselves out. And on the surface, that felt reasonable. I had stories, I had seasons under my belt, I could talk about hunts, terrain, and situations with some level of confidence, but confidence and improvement are not the same thing. What I was really doing was repeating the same mistakes with more familiarity. I'd hunt the same way year after year and call it consistency. I'd make the same decisions, take the same approaches, and explain the same outcomes with better excuses. When something worked, I credited my experience. When it didn't, I blamed conditions, pressure, weather, or bad luck. What I didn't do very often was challenge my own patterns, and that's where experience becomes dangerous. Experience without reflection doesn't create growth, it creates grooves, and the deeper those grooves get, the harder it becomes to see alternatives. This is how I've always done it, becomes the default answer, even when the results don't justify it. There were years where I hunted a lot and learned very little, not because the opportunities weren't there, but because I wasn't extracting the lessons. I wasn't reviewing decisions honestly. I wasn't asking why certain approaches failed or why certain moments felt rushed or chaotic. I was collecting hunts instead of collecting insight. The shift happened when I stopped measuring progress by time and started measuring it by change. Did I hunt differently this year than last year? Did I make better decisions under pressure? Did I recognize patterns sooner? Did I avoid mistakes I used to repeat? Those questions were uncomfortable because they forced me to admit when I wasn't actually improving, but they were also freeing because once I saw the pattern, I could break it. Progress didn't come from more seasons, it came from more honesty. When I started reviewing hunts without ego, looking at where emotion crept in, where impatience showed up, where fatigue changed my decisions, I began to improve faster than I had in years. Not because I was hunting more, but because I was learning better. Experience only becomes progress when it's examined. Once I understood that, every season mattered more. Wins taught me why things worked. Losses showed me exactly what to fix. And instead of letting years slip by under the illusion of growth, I finally started turning time in the field into something that actually made me a better hunter. The real turning point for me came when hunting stopped being emotional and started becoming intentional. For a long time, I tied too much of my identity to outcomes. Success felt like validation, failures felt personal. Every season became a quiet test of whether I was good enough, and that pressure leaked into every decision I made on the mountain. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was hunting to prove something instead of hunting to execute well and obviously enjoy it. When you hunt emotionally, everything else feels urgent and not fun. Every bugle feels like it has to turn into a play. Every sighting feels like it has to end with a stalk. Every slow morning feels like time slipping away. That urgency pushes you to force decisions, rush setups, and abandon good plans too early. You stop letting the hunt unfold and start trying to bend it to your expectations. That was me for years. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly after enough sessions where effort didn't equal results and frustration kept repeating itself. Eventually, I had to admit that the common denominator wasn't the animals, the pressure, or the conditions. It was how I was showing up mentally. I started separating who I was from what happened. A blown stock wasn't proof I was failing, it was just information. A quiet day wasn't wasted, it was data. A missed opportunity wasn't something to rush away from, it was something to understand. Once I made that separation, everything calmed down. When emotion stopped driving decisions, clarity showed up. I stopped forcing moves just to feel productive. I stopped rushing shots to avoid regret. I stopped chasing moments and started trusting systems. I could sit longer without spiraling. I could move without second guessing. I could pass opportunities without feeling like I was giving something up. And ironically, that's when results improved. Calm decision making created better timing. Better timing created better setups. Better setups created cleaner shots, and cleaner outcomes reinforced my trust in the process instead of attachment to the result. Hunting became quieter, slower, and more deliberate. And that quiet was powerful. When you're not emotionally hijacked by every moment, you see more, you think clearer, you adapt instead of react. You don't need everything to happen right now, and it doesn't have to be perfect because you trust that if you keep executing correctly, opportunities will come. That turning point didn't make hunting easier, but it made it cleaner. And once hunting stopped being about proving something and started being about doing the work well, I finally felt like I was in control instead of constantly chasing it. That's when I knew I wasn't more experienced. I was finally becoming a better hunter. If I could sit down with my younger self, the version of me that was working hard, caring deeply, and still struggling to find consistency, there's a lot I'd want to say, right? We all would, but it would all come back to one central idea: stop trying to earn results through effort alone. For a long time, I believed that if I just wanted it badly enough and worked hard enough, things would eventually fall into place. I thought effort was the currency of success because that's what I'd used my whole life in athletics or business. If I suffered more, hiked further, stayed longer, and pushed harder, the mountain would eventually reward me. Sometimes that's true, but that belief kept me busy. It didn't necessarily make me better. What I'd tell that younger version of myself is that effort without direction just burns time and energy. And time is the one thing you don't get back. You can spend 10 seasons repeating the same habits and call it experience, or you can spend 2 seasons learning deliberately and change everything. I'd tell him to slow down sooner, not just physically, but mentally, to stop reacting to every stimulus and start asking better questions. Why are animals here? Why now? Why this terrain? Why this wind? Those questions matter more than how far you can push in a day. I tell him to stop hiding behind toughness. Toughness feels good, it's easy to measure, but it also makes it easy to ignore weak links. I'd explain that durability, patience, and clarity beat raw grit every time, especially over long seasons and long years. I'd also tell him that humility speeds progress. The moment you assume you know enough is the moment learning slows down. The best hunters I know are still curious. They still review mistakes. They still question their assumptions. They don't protect their ego, they protect their process. And finally, I'd tell him this: you don't need to prove anything to the mountain. The mountain doesn't care how hard you worked or how badly you want it. It responds to timing, positioning, patience, and execution. When you stop trying to force outcomes and start focusing on doing the small things well, consistently, the results take care of themselves. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself somewhere in these mistakes, that is not a bad thing. It means you're paying attention, and paying attention is where progress actually starts. You don't have to spend decades learning what I did. You can start shortening the curve right now by being honest about what's holding you back and being willing to change it. That's what I wish I'd understood sooner. When I look back at the last 34 years, I don't feel any regret. Well, maybe a little here and there, misses, missed opportunities, but ultimately, what I mostly feel is clarity. Every mistake I talked about today came from the same place: caring deeply, working hard, and aiming effort in the wrong direction. I wasn't lazy, I wasn't unserious, I just didn't have the perspective yet to see what was actually holding me back. Chasing noise instead of patterns kept me reactive. Relying on gear instead of skill delayed real growth. Moving too fast disguised poor timing. Ignoring recovery quietly narrowed my options. Confusing experience with progress slowed my learning curve. Letting emotion drive decisions made everything harder than it needed to be. None of those mistakes disappeared overnight. They were corrected through honesty, reflection, and the willingness to change how I hunted instead of just hunting more. That's the part I want to leave you with. Becoming a better hunter isn't about adding more tactics to your toolbox. It's about removing the habits that are costing you opportunity without you realizing it. It's about learning how to slow down mentally, see patterns sooner, make calmer decisions, and trust a process instead of chasing moments. If you recognized yourself in any of these mistakes, that is not a failure. That's awareness, and awareness is where progress starts. You don't need another decade to get better. You need better questions, better systems, and the willingness to look honestly at how you're hunting now. When you do that, improvement stops feeling random and starts feeling repeatable. If you want to build that kind of structure, that's exactly why I built Team Backbone. Team Backbone exists to help hunters shorten the learning curve, develop real skills in the off-season, and hunt with more clarity and confidence when when season arrives. Inside, you're going to find training, fieldcraft breakdowns, planning tools, mindset work, and direct access to me so you're not figuring this out alone. It's built for hunters who are serious about improving, not just staying busy. You can learn more about Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath the membership tab. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.